In the Second World War, sugar wasn't missing. It was gone. Milk evaporated from shelves. Flour turned into contraband. And yet, people still craved comfort. In shattered kitchens and frozen bunkers, families didn't bake cakes. They improvised them from roots, bark, and scraps that didn't belong in an oven. Turnips were boiled down to candy. Carrot paste hardened into brittle bars. Acorns lost their bitterness in fire and patience. These weren't luxuries. They were the only smiles left in cities swallowed by silence. Junk food wasn't a brand. It was a memory, twisted into existence by mothers, grandmothers, and anyone desperate to distract a starving child. What they made wasn't sweet, but it was enough to keep spirits awake when bodies were fading. These are 9 junk foods WWII families invented without sugar, milk, or flour. Some were bitter, some were burnt, but every bite was defiance, swallowed in silence. If you value raw survival knowledge and the forgotten lessons behind it, subscribe now. This isn't nostalgia, it's preparation. Number 1, carrot candy, sugarless sweets of war. When sugar vanished from cupboards and ration books offered only crumbs of sweetness, families didn't stop craving treats. They redefined them. In kitchens where butter had disappeared and flour was stretched with dried roots, the carrot became a quiet miracle. It wasn't a vegetable anymore. It was candy. Across Britain, the US, and parts of occupied Europe, wartime nutritionists encouraged a radical idea. Cook your sweets, don't buy them. Carrots, plentiful, homegrown, and naturally sweet, became the unexpected backbone of desserts. Housewives grated them raw, boiled them soft, or mashed them into dense pastes. Then, using tiny amounts of rationed flour, they folded them into cookies, puddings, and mock fudge. The result wasn't dessert, as we know it. There was no sugar crust, no glaze, no decadence, just sweetness stolen from the ground and coaxed into shape. Some boiled grated carrot with a spoonful of honey or golden syrup until it reduced into a sticky, pliable paste. Others added dried fruit, cinnamon, or even a few grains of salt to deepen the illusion. The candy was then pressed into tins, rolled into balls, or cut into squares, and dried near a stove. This wasn't a luxury. It was psychological warfare against deprivation. Something to give children on holidays when cake was only a memory. Something to chew on during blackout nights when the body craved more than bread. Carrot candy offered the illusion of normal without using anything the war could take away. Its nutritional value was no illusion. Carrots delivered vitamins A and C, fiber, and enough natural sugar to trick the tongue. In some homes, a spoonful of mashed carrot was mixed with a few drops of lemon juice and dried into strips resembling sour taffy. The tricks were endless. The ingredients, few, but each piece carried more than flavor. It carried intent. Still, it had limits. The taste could never replace chocolate. The texture was often soft, sometimes fibrous, and those who had eaten real sweets before the war never forgot the difference. But this wasn't about comparison. It was about control over hunger, over morale, over a world that offered less each season. Carrot candy didn't survive the post-war years. Supermarkets replaced it. Sugar returned. The recipes were forgotten. But in war, it filled a silence that nothing else could. A sweetness earned, not bought. So if sugar vanished tomorrow, would you know how to make joy out of roots? Number 2, potato peel crisps. Crisps without the potato. When food was scarce, waste wasn't an option. Every scrap, stalk, and skin had value, and none more so than the part most modern kitchens discard: potato peels. In wartime, Britain, Germany, and Soviet-held territories, potatoes weren't peeled and tossed. They were rationed like gold, and the skins? They became a snack in their own right. Crisps born from scarcity, not convenience. Civilians saved peels from every meal. The trick was to clean the potatoes thoroughly before peeling, because the skin, not the flesh, would be consumed. Once collected, the peels were dried on cloths near stoves or windows, preserving them until enough had gathered to make a batch worth cooking. There was no oil in excess, no deep fryer. Instead, the peels were brushed lightly with lard or margarine, if available, or simply tossed with salt, dried herbs, or sometimes nothing at all. They were then baked in hot ovens, placed on cast iron pans, or crisped near open flames. What emerged wasn't a modern crisp. It was tougher, earthier, sometimes bitter, but it was something crunchy in a world of boiled meals and mush. Children ate them like treats, Adults used them to stretch meals. And in many households, they became tradition, not by choice, but by necessity. Some added vinegar, others rubbed garlic onto the pans. In parts of Eastern Europe, these crisps were even layered with onions and baked again, forming makeshift casseroles when ingredients were few. But they had a function far beyond taste. Potato peel crisps kept people full. The skins retained fiber, potassium, and trace nutrients that helped bodies endure malnutrition. When the main dishes grew thin, they bulked the plate. And when hunger stretched beyond what could be reasoned with, they distracted the senses just long enough to feel fed. Still, this method had its drawbacks. Improper cleaning could lead to illness. Peels left too long would mold. And overcooking made them brittle and bitter. But compared to going without, they were more than enough. Today, these crisps are forgotten, replaced by factory-made bags filled with flavorings and preservatives. But in a world where nothing could be spared, families found a way to turn refuse into resilience. Ever wonder what survival sounds like? Sometimes, it's the crunch of something the war forgot to take. Number 3, carrot marmalade, jam without fruit. In homes without orchards and winters without citrus, sweet spreads didn't vanish, they adapted. Across wartime Europe, where sugar was rationed and fruit was rare, families found a substitute buried in the dirt: carrots. Carrot marmalade wasn't a luxury. It was an innovation under siege. In Britain's Ministry of Food guides and across occupied territories, carrot jam became a government-endorsed method to stretch rations and preserve morale. Sweetness, after all, wasn't just taste, it was relief. The process was deceptively simple. Carrots were boiled until soft, then mashed into a coarse pulp. To this, small amounts of sugar, often from ration allowances or trade, were added. When available, citrus peel or juice from bitter oranges enhanced the flavor. But more often, vinegar, cinnamon, and clove stood in for absent fruit. The result, a bright orange preserve, tangy and sweet, that resembled marmalade in texture, if not in origin. Families stored it in reused jars, sealed with wax or fabric, hidden away in cellars or cupboards for the leanest days. It spread easily on stale bread, bulked up porridge, and served as a rare reward during harsh months. Some added turnips or Swedes to increase volume. Others used beetroot for color and richness. But carrots remained the core because they were cheap, available, and packed with beta-carotene, which helped ward off vitamin deficiencies in children and the elderly. Yet this method wasn't without its flaws. Spoilage came quickly if jars weren't properly sealed. Overcooking ruined the texture, and when sugar ran out entirely, the jam became closer to paste, edible but grim. Still, it was better than nothing. Much better. In kitchens blacked out by war and filled with ration books instead of recipes, this marmalade became more than just food. It was color in a gray world, a spoonful of brightness in days that offered little else. Modern shelves are lined with jams boasting imported berries and artificial flavors. But the wartime carrot marmalade, made from scraps and silence, was something else entirely. It didn't aim to impress. It aimed to endure. One vegetable, one spoonful of sweetness, one more reminder that even in war, people found ways to make life taste like something worth holding on to. Number 4, oat pancakes without eggs or milk. In cities turned to rubble and villages cut off by snow, traditional breakfasts became impossible luxuries. Eggs vanished first. Then milk. Butter followed. But hunger didn't wait, so families made pancakes from what remained. Oats, water, and fire. These weren't soft or golden. They didn't rise. There was no syrup. Just oats, rolled or ground, mixed with water and a pinch of salt, flattened into rough cakes, and cooked over whatever heat source could be trusted not to give them away. The method spread across Britain, Scandinavia, and parts of Eastern Europe where dairy shortages were routine and fuel was scarce. Some called them oat cakes. Others knew them simply as survival flats. Without animal fat, these cakes were dry. Without milk, they were dense. But they filled the stomach, and that was enough. The batter was basic. Oats soaked in hot water until soft, mashed into a paste, then shaped and pressed by hand. Frying pans were rare. Tin sheets, flat stones, or scorched lids stood in. When lard or drippings were available, it was used sparingly, to grease the surface, not flavor the cake. Some families mixed in mashed potatoes or carrot pulp to stretch the batch. Others added wild herbs or dried nettles to disguise the blandness. In occupied Poland, finely ground acorns were sometimes blended with oats to add bitterness and bulk. Every variation had one purpose: calories that didn't spoil. They cooked quickly, often within minutes. A child could carry one in a pocket. A mother could feed 5 with a handful of grain and the heat of a coal tin. These weren't meals to be enjoyed. They were units of survival, counted, rationed, and shared without pleasure. But in freezing homes and silent shelters, oat pancakes became something else. They were dependable, reproducible, defiant. They didn't need eggs. They didn't need milk. They didn't need anything but heat, patience, and resolve. No one dreamed of oat pancakes, but millions survived because of them. Number 5, barley coffee. When real coffee vanished from shelves and black markets, civilians didn't wake up with silence. They woke up with barley, roasted, ground, and boiled. This bitter substitute gave warmth when nothing else did. In war-torn Italy, France, and parts of Eastern Europe, barley coffee became a ritual of resilience. Known as caffè d'orzo in Italy, it was brewed not for taste, but for memory, for the illusion of normal life in a world where nothing remained. The process started with raw barley. Unmilled, whole grains were washed, dried, and roasted over open flames or in battered pans. The longer they roasted, the darker the result. Families stirred constantly, judging readiness not by recipe, but by smell. Once cooled, the grains were crushed using whatever was available: rolling pins, bricks, hand mills, until reduced to coarse grounds. Stored in jars, tins, or folded paper, this powder became the poor man's espresso. It contained no caffeine, no sweetness, just warmth, just ritual. Boiled with water and sometimes chicory root or acorns, the mixture turned black and strong-smelling. For those who could afford it, a drop of milk or spoon of sugar transformed it into something close to comfort. But most drank it plain, hot, smoky, and sharp. Children drank it, elders drank it, soldiers carried it in cloth pouches stitched by hand. It was safe, shelf-stable, and it offered something most wartime food couldn't: familiarity. It didn't wake the body, but it steadied the spirit. In the absence of real coffee, this became the stand-in. And when people finally tasted coffee again, years later, they still remembered the barley, because this wasn't just a beverage. It was a pause in the chaos, a small cup that made silence bearable, a dark liquid that didn't stimulate, but reminded. Caffeine fades, but ritual endures. Number 6, dried apple rings. Under the blackout skies of wartime Germany and across the frost-bitten farmlands of Poland, apples were never wasted. Not even bruised ones, not even peels. When fresh food vanished, families didn't throw away fruit. They transformed it into thin, salted rings that needed no sugar, no preservatives, and no power to keep. Dried apple rings with salt became one of the few sweet things left when rations turned bitter. The process was stripped down, deliberate, and done in silence. Apples were peeled and cored with pocket knives, then sliced into thin rings, no thicker than a coin. But the secret wasn't just the drying, it was the salt. Not to season, but to draw out moisture, to repel insects, and to prevent mold. A light dusting was rubbed on both sides before the rings were laid on linen cloths, wire mesh, or wooden slats, and placed near open windows, stoves, or in attic rafters. In warmer regions, they were hung on strings and left in the sun, twisted gently by wind and time. Families didn't dry apples for taste. They did it for preservation. Dried rings could last 6 months, sometimes longer if sealed in tins or wrapped in wax paper. Salt kept the sweetness locked in while stopping spoilage. And when winter came, a handful of these shriveled rings could turn a pot of porridge into something close to dessert. They were also portable, packed in cloth, slipped into coat pockets, or hidden in boots. They became emergency rations, fuel for children, trade for medicine, or something warm to chew when the cold silenced everything else. Some villages even taught children how to make them as early as 6 or 7. It wasn't just food, it was training. Because if you didn't know how to keep an apple alive through winter, you didn't know how to keep yourself alive either. There were no ovens, no machines, just fruit, salt, and the patience to wait for them to change. In a world where sugar had vanished and rot was constant, dried apple rings with salt became one of the most enduring survival snacks. Not because they were sweet, but because they were possible. And for families staring down another empty season, that was enough. One forgotten trick, one more day alive. Number 7, potato peel pancakes. When whole potatoes became too valuable to cook, families turned to what others would throw away, the skins. In Nazi-occupied Poland, blockaded Russia, and across famine-stricken parts of northern France, potato peels weren't garbage. They were potential. Peeled carefully, cleaned of dirt, and boiled until soft, they became the base for one of the war's most desperate creations, peel pancakes. These weren't thick or fluffy. They weren't golden or crisp. They were survival, fried thin in lard if you had it, or scorched dry on metal sheets if you didn't. To make them bind, families mixed in bits of flour, crumbled oats, or even mashed boiled weeds. If an egg was available, it was split across several cakes. Salt, if there was any, was treasured. Often, seasoning came from leftover fat scraped from pans or meat drippings saved in jars. The peels were ground or mashed into pulp, then formed into discs by hand. No rolling pins, no recipes, just instinct and memory. They were cooked over open fire stoves, in chimneys, or on hot stones placed inside brick ovens long since cracked. Once cooled, they hardened quickly. But that didn't matter. In ghettos and bunkers, a single potato peel pancake could mean calories for a child or one more night of steady breath for the sick. Mothers stored them wrapped in rags, stacking them beside coals to keep dry. Some traded them for soap. Others soaked them in broth to soften the corners. They weren't meant to taste good. They were meant to stop hunger from swallowing the family whole. And in many cases, they did. Because in war, you don't wait for ingredients. You use what's left. And sometimes, what's left are peels, crisped into life, scorched into sustenance. It wasn't a meal. It was a refusal to give up. Number 8, burnt bread crust coffee. In cities where the aroma of roasted beans once meant peace, war turned that memory into ash. When coffee vanished from shelves and ration coupons offered nothing but inked denial, civilians didn't stop drinking. They adapted. Across bombed-out Rotterdam, hunger-racked Berlin, and occupied Paris, people began roasting the one thing left behind: bread crusts. The blackened, inedible ends of old loaves, once tossed to pigs or compost, were dried until rock-hard, then roasted again over flame until scorched. The goal wasn't taste, it was mimicry. These hardened pieces were then ground by hand, using mortars, rolling pins, or bricks, into a bitter, smoky powder. This powder was steeped in boiling water like coffee grounds. It froze, it darkened, and it tricked the senses. There was no caffeine, no aroma, only the illusion of routine in a world unraveling. Some added a pinch of barley, acorns, or even dried chicory roots, when they could find them. Others stirred in beet sugar if a neighbor had some to spare. It didn't lift spirits, but it brought back a rhythm. In shelters and cellars, families would gather around cups of this bitter liquid, not for energy, but for memory. Because sometimes survival isn't just calories. It's holding on to one small thing that reminds you what life felt like before it broke, even if that thing is just a cup of burnt bread. Number 9, Vinegar Taffy. You hear the word taffy and think of summer fairs, sticky fingers, and sugar highs. But in war-torn Europe, the sweetness was stripped away. What remained was vinegar. Vinegar taffy wasn't a treat. It was a last resort. Cooked in crumbling kitchens where flour was banned, Sugar was gone, and milk was a distant dream. Mothers didn't make it to celebrate. They made it to distract. Because even the illusion of candy could silence a hungry child for a few minutes. So how did they do it? They started with vinegar, usually apple cider, if they could barter for it. Cheap, acidic, and shelf-stable. Then came the substitute sweeteners and beet syrup, boiled carrots, mashed apples, or whatever leftover fruit they had fermented into something vaguely sugary. No exact measurements, no recipe cards, just guesswork, heat, and prayer. This sour-sweet mix was brought to a boil in dented pots over makeshift stoves, sometimes nothing more than hot rocks and scrap wood. The air filled with the sharp sting of vinegar. It didn't smell like candy, it smelled like desperation. Once thickened, the liquid was poured onto a slab, an old tray, a cracked plate, even a piece of slate. As it cooled, the children gathered, not for a sugar rush, but for a break from reality. Mothers would stretch and twist the cooled slab into strands, not too soft, not too brittle, just chewy enough to be called taffy. Sometimes a pinch of salt was added, sometimes ashes were scraped off the edges. No two batches were ever the same. Some were sour, some were burned. Some clung to your teeth like glue, but each piece, each bite, was a gesture of love under siege. For a few minutes, kids had something to suck on, something to fight over, something to chew that wasn't just bark or crust or boiled weeds. Vinegar Taffy didn't make anyone full. It didn't cure hunger, but it gave children a moment of normalcy, a sliver of sweetness in a world turned bitter. Even today, you'll find remnants of this recipe in old war diaries, passed down in whispers, not because it was delicious, but because it mattered. Because in times of collapse, survival isn't just about what fills the stomach, it's also about what keeps the spirit alive, one sour piece at a time. They didn't call it junk food they eat. They called it survival. When sugar vanished and flour was gone, when milk curdled into memory, WWII families still fed their children. Not with indulgence, with invention. They roasted crusts into coffee, fried dough without grain, made sweetness from boiled beet skins, and hope scraped from the bottom of a pot. This wasn't resilience born in comfort. It was desperation turned into discipline. Because you don't survive war by waiting. You survive by remembering. And they remembered how to stretch scraps into sustenance, how to make one more meal when it should have been the last. Today, we call it lost knowledge. But for them, it was the only knowledge that mattered. If these forgotten foods moved you, if this glimpse into history hit deeper than any prepping guide or recipe ever could, then don't let it disappear again. Subscribe, because every subscriber helps preserve the wisdom they died holding on to, because the lights might fail again. And when they do, it won't be the newest tech that saves us. It'll be old hands, old skills, and memories like these. One more subscription, one more step toward remembering what they never forgot.